Well, thank you for this nice introduction. Probably foremost, I like to be called a free thinker because that was a privilege which I could really have in the 40 years of my business career on the one hand, and probably Christian Lindner, my party had enjoys me also because I'm free thinking, and I gave a very clear and bitter balance sheet after the last elections in Saxonia and Brandenburg, publicly on Facebook, and later on with Gabor Steingart. So I'm really, I joined politics in the age of 67. I'm now 70 years old. And I became a political startup. And probably if you look at a little bit on my life, I had been working all my life in those dinosaurs. On the one hand, for 20 years in the old Daimler-Benz AG. But here I really talk about Daimler-Benz Aerospace, nowadays Airbus. And the transformational issue of diversification of the Daimler Group, which failed at the end, but which was a great venture in the late 80s, spin-offs and the creation of Airbus. Then I was working for 10 years at Lufthansa. It was like a taxpayer's office in the early 90s, civil servants on hand, and transforming the company into a private carrier, and my job was to privatize heads and hearts. The other people privatized the structures and the public offerings, and I myself, I was, so to say, responsible for the cultural reform. And same happened then when I joined Conti in Hanover in 2003. An automotive supplier, big crisis, debt crisis, billions of debts, and a globalization issue ahead. Probably Conti was in those years the forerunner in the globalization of German industry. And that was something I really could join. In those years, I benchmarked the development of research facilities all over the world. How can we speed up the learning curve so that we can ramp up engineering operations worldwide, not just production operations. Those issues really helped to transform the company into a global player. And then in 2007, I was called for the turnaround of Deutsche Telekom. I was 5 days in the company, and I had an 11-week strike on the hand. And we really got through that and got the turnaround happening, so that at least telecom nowadays is one-eyed amongst the blinds. Now, those are, I always choose corporations which were not anymore, but not yet. And transformation probably is not yet, but not the old one either. So it's the path in between an old state of being and a new state of being. And now I'm, since 2 years in politics, and I reflect that a closed system like the German parliament is as difficult to move as ThyssenKrupp. And to believe that the whole world is changing in business and the political system can be stable is a deep misbelief. And so I'm working heavily beside my role as speaker for innovation, education, and research. I intensively work on issues. How can you transform the parliamentary system in a system which is much closer to the people? Because if you look around Italy or Holland or France, old traditional parties, they get their Ubers. And the old traditional parties decline to minimalist parties. And new platforms arise, political platforms, much more temporary, much more unstable and much more fragile, but new platforms attacking the old systems. So that's an interesting view. And so number one, I learn a lot. Number two, I tackle a lot. When we really talk about the topic of my contribution, I kind of go back to a very, very old classic study, a classic book of Professor Richard Florida, an American sociologist, who wrote about the rise of the creative class 19 years ago. And he very simply said, talent, technology, tolerance are the contributing factors for a metropolitan city, for a region, for a corporation, really to drive transformation ahead. That is, and he elaborated that intensively on different examples worldwide. And naturally, he started with the Silicon Valley and ended with Singapore, and really wrote the stories about the TTTT. And that is something I find very simple to remember on the one hand, and on the other side, it's a good line to really make a contribution. I will talk about the change of change, about closed systems, which I believe are fatal for business and society. I will talk about the connection, the correlation between technology and diversity as twins for cultural transformation. And I will talk about some paths for transformation, how I see them, and hopefully we have a vivid discussion afterward. And I will stop after each of those points, and we will have time, if there are any questions on your mind, really to ask me, or bring your own statements on the table. When I was a young man, we had what we call backwards now, the episodic change. Change didn't really happen in corporations. It happened when a sudden event came, electricity crisis or new product development. And then a company had an emergency electricity facility. Then a company had a warehouse and a stock up, and a company had human resources for ramping up the product introduction. So it was episodical, it was controlled change. That was my young life at Daimler-Benz. It was a smooth corporate environment, and once in a while something happened and you had to react, but you always knew what could happen. In the 90s till, let's say, the midst of the last century, I would say we had a phase in German economy which I would call the continuous change. Companies were shrinking and growing. They grew organically and unorganically. Merger and acquisitions, joint ventures, strategic alliances were shaping the design of the organizations. The divisionalization made it possible to sell one division and to buy another division. So change was kind of built in the organization. On the labor side or on the human side, lease work started, temporary work started, outsourcing started, and so the change within the company, no matter on the business side, but also on the people side, was so to say built in the organization. You will have the presentation afterwards. So if you want to write down something which is special, do that. Otherwise, you have the presentation. Probably, and I was responsible for the operation in Lufthansa. September 11, 2001. Probably symbolically, kind of was a symbolic point how the character of change changed. Because suddenly you had events happening where you never thought about. No matter if it was a terrorist attack, or if it was the mad cow disease or SARS, diseases who suddenly came across all the world, disruptive internet warfare, whatsoever. You came as an economy, as a corporation, but also as a public, as a nation. Probably this third layer, the other ones didn't disappear, but it was a layer of change adding up, piling up on each other. So, and probably, and my topic deals very strongly with this last part, because everything you can read about it and research, it says you need a resilient, open, and diverse organization to cope with the diversity of the environment. The Kubernetes expert Ross Ashby, he once famously said, if a corporation does not have the variety and the diversity which is in the outside environment, cope with its survival. So but this means that is a real challenge. What does it mean to integrate the complexity and the variety of the outside world to deal with the dramatic changes? And that's probably more or less, I don't have the answer, but I have some thoughts about it, which I share with you. Now, obviously, the animation does not really work. You can see that that enterprises are dying increasingly faster and increasingly younger. 75% of enterprises do not survive more than 25 years. In one of the charts here on the right hand, the death rate of US startups is between 70 and 80%. Humans reach an age of an average 80, whereas companies have an age till about 25 years. And here a very new study, the average age of a company in Standard & Poor 500 fell from 60 years in the 50s to less than 20 years in the 90s. 53 companies from the 55 edition of the Fortune 500 were still on the list in 2080, so roughly 10%. The average lifespan of a small and medium enterprise in China is 3.7 years. Compare that with Deutscher Mittelstand. You see a real difference. And a third of new US businesses exit within their first 2 years, and half exit within their first 5 years. So the lifetime of organizations is shrinking, given the fact of the external pressure on the organization. And naturally, it's an interesting question. Well, on the one hand, I always say companies have a right to die. And old companies like ThyssenKrupp, for example, or Deutsche Bank, have really a good right to die. But on the other hand, the interesting point is, can companies which are still healthy live a little bit longer, on the one hand, and that's called transformation. On the other hand, can you create new business? Those are the two drivers. Now, probably, and there is a lot of research beyond that, which you can, if you, for example, look at the global competitive research and survey of IMD in Lausanne, or if you look at the Reuters index on innovative companies and innovative economies, and so on, if you look where artificial intelligence is not only nurtured, but also leads to significant and scaling enterprises. Probably some years ago, where the situation was not like that, I would have said Germany is in the sandwich between the digital house US and the machine house China. But now I have to add those two players left and right as digital players, since China has close to 28% of the global turnover in the digital economy. So we really talk about something, and if you compare, let's say, the platform economies, then Europe has 3%, 2 of it through SAP. The US has 65%, and China has the rest. So, and I did a speech for graduates of the University of Paderborn in information technology, and the speech had the title, "Why does Germany have 4 car makers but only 1 SAP?" So loving to have 4 car makers, but we need at least 4 SAPs. SAP standing for Internet Giants, but we don't have that. So, and actually in that sense, and if you look at how do we finance the welfare state in the future, if we don't create those value creation from digital enterprises, Siemens does not pay your pensions, and Alibaba does not pay it either. So that say the old economy will not be enough to have that welfare state, to keep that living. We need to have a digital economy on the rise to finance, so to say, what we have as a well-being within society. You probably are well aware about that. Why is it so difficult that corporations change? And Clayton Christensen, he wrote this famous book, which was translated 15 years later into German, The Innovators Dilemma. This is also kind of tells you how long it takes till ideas creep over the ocean and come, let's say, in our economic debate. And he debates very simple. He says, the reason for failure is the success. The more successful you are in your old established business, the more you are not able to cannibalize your business, take money out, and invest it in unknown territory. Especially difficult on stock exchanges in Germany, which have much less patient capital than the US stock market. Patient capital means you have a longer time span till you expect the return on invest. But this also depends on the amount of venture capital. And so to say, our stock market is very short-terminist. And corporations, big corporations, are very much inclined then not to invest in unknown territories. And on the other hand, the challenge of work, the book from Brynjolfsson and McAfee, Race Against the Machine. The one book debates the end of the traditional firm, and the other book debates the end of the old work or the end of work. And those are two big debates where actually the scientific community is split. You would have Pew Research in the US, a scientific organization, but was asking 4,000 specialists in labor markets, will robots destroy work, but will there be new work created? Or will robots destroy work and no work will be created? The split in the academic community is exactly 50-50. So you look in a crystal ball on that issue. But probably as a society and as a corporation, you should be well prepared for something which is going on this side. But most of the organizations are still very blind. Well, okay, I'm quit here for some minutes and just ask you if there are questions or statements or comments in the room. Please.
Why do you think that Germany is lacking with digital commerce in this industry? Why did they fail?
Well, there is a Russian economist, Kondratyev, who was kind of a predecessor of Schumpeter, who said economy is developing in long cycles. And the energy and the machinery is is the second and the third cycle. And network and communication is cycle number 5. And he also had the thesis, the more successful you are in those former cycles, the more you rest in that, and you don't actually in the same way as this American author said, you really don't move into that. Number 2, why? At the end, human beings, why should they change in a time where everything looks good? And human beings are also the runners of the companies. No matter if they are stock listed companies the DAX companies, or if it's a small and medium-sized enterprise, Mittelstand. And you know how things are, you know the customer, you know the markets. So you think you will cope with change. You stay in the middle of this change things, but on the other hand, change is coming in a different way nowadays. Number 3, Germans love material things. Things which you can touch. Machinery is a symbol, let's say, man kann es anfassen. So, and software is not to touch. So, and this haptic society probably is also an issue. And we are excellent in incremental innovation. So process optimization. So if we really look on the innovation side, we have a hard time on the product innovation, even more on business model innovation, but we are pretty good still on the process innovation. So you squeeze out enough returns out of the processes, which are not the customers and not the markets, but the processes. So you have a very internal view on things. Though these different factors come together. More questions? No, that's not enough. Probably, if we don't lower the risk hurdle for the so-called Kapitalsammelstellen, which are insurers, financial institutions who usually serve, let's say, a better good, and where the saving accounts need to be protected. If you don't lower that hurdle and say you can invest more into what kind of a fund, this will not happen. So we need to open up the venture capital side also for our very traditional Kapitalsammelstellen. Pension funds, Versicherungen, etc. And then adding it up to corporate ventures. But the corporate ventures are not enough at all. Yeah, some more questions? If not so, I go on. Closed systems fatal for business and society. And here we come a little bit closer to your question, why don't companies change? Well, there is a lot of research has been done in this field. 3 years ago, Boston Consulting Group made a big study, which is still on the surface, above the iceberg, the water level for the iceberg. And they really showed empirically, the larger you grow, the harder time you have to change the organization. And if you do not change the organization, you just grow it, you grow bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is killing innovation. Sum it up, that's the context of this empirical research, which was done on 1,500 companies. Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel, he wrote a book about only the paranoids survive, which is one of the most famous management sellers in the world. And he argues that corporations are not paranoid enough to see when the enemy is around the door or around the corner. That companies do not have a sensory system to see when change, which goes like that, suddenly has the tipping point and goes up. And that this sensory system for the coming of the tipping point, and then on the other hand, have a fast response organization is really the point. And he developed, and Intel was very successfully run, and many companies copied that. On the one hand, that they created by their sales force a a sensory system for trends in technology and environment and had channels directly back to the CEO on the one hand. And every half year, all the business units of Intel had to undergo a 360-degree venture where they had to discuss with their colleagues how they could kill their own business. So to exercise destruction, to prevent destruction. It was called confrontative meetings. That was the name in Intel those times. Now that is a second, more a case study-based view. Lack of sensory system on the one hand and lack of rapid response in the corporation. Gilbert Probst from Geneva and Reich from St. Gallen, they studied 100 companies who were successful and who burned out. And they detected a tendency that successful companies try to make more of the same. And by becoming more of the same, they become out of an innovator an efficiency squeezer, which is burning out the corporation. So this goes deeper in the iceberg issue because this touches cultural issues of burnout because the organization has to go faster, faster, and faster on the same track. Do the same, but do it more, do it higher, do it faster. That's what they discovered. And Rosbeth Moss-Kanter from Harvard, she came up with a theory of closed systems and so-called homosocial reproduction. Homosocial reproduction means Schmidt sucht Schmidtchen. Smith is looking for little Smith. Similarity attracts similar ones. Birds of the same kind are flocking together. That corporations have an issue, also new organizations like Uber or the Sumber organizations, that they tend to attract similarity, to choose the same of the kind, and that on the midterm and on the long run, this homosocial reproduction is excluding diversity of thoughts. Now that is a very deep-going theory which was well acclaimed not only in the academic world but also in the business world, and it's one of the roots why the diversity issue, which is much more than the issue how many ladies are in management. If you talk about diversity, you mainly talk about diversity of mind. How that really came in the debate in the corporations. And I might come up with an interesting study for you from Boston Consulting at the end and the Technical University about the correlation between innovation and diversity. But those are some theories about why companies are blind for their deep-rooted problems. And I would like to a little bit to elaborate on this closed systems issue and give you some examples to get you a flavor what that means. Homosocial reproduction means, and I just wrote in Manager magazine, I wrote an essay about Bayer, about why the head of the supervisory board, Wenning, and the CEO, Baumann, they have exactly the same careers. They have the same education. They have the same careers. The young Baumann is a reproduction of the old Wenning. So when I took that as an example, how by choosing the same pattern in people, even going down to the same socialization process, educational background, how you might come in real difficulty because this clone of yourself is really stepping in your shoes. And if you look a little bit around in big dinosaurs in Germany, you will see a very high similarity between the CEOs and even amongst the board members. Same educational backgrounds, same socialization processes, very little change within industries, mainly in one, maximum two industries, having the career mostly in the own organization, and so on. There was an interesting piece of research about Fukushima, the nuclear disaster in Japan. And the conclusion was the Keio University in Tokyo was an incubator for an incestuous closed system. Researchers found out that 90% of all managers in TEPCO, which was the Generalunternehmer of the nuclear plants and the atomic agency in Japan, came from Keio University. They had the same academic background, the same academic culture. Then they came in either into TEPCO or in the control agency, and their next career step was like that. You went from the atomic control agency into TEPCO and went up the ladder, and you went from TEPCO into the controlling agency. So you had an interlinked career systems, and the ones who controlled formerly TEPCO were the ones who were then the managers of TEPCO. So that's, by the way, that's why the Deutsche Finanzämter changed the people who check your Steuererklärung, because if you have the same patterns between the one who has to pay taxes and the one who is controlling what's being paid, you are in a high risk of having a conclusive incestuous relationship. But the career patterns really were intermingled, and there were strong friendship bonds zwischen the ones who should be controlled and the ones who control. And then you have a hard problem with collusion of interests. Recruiting the same patterns, matching careers, more of the same. And historically, you could see the number of hundreds of small incidents before Fukushima actually happened, which were neglected from the Atomic Control Agency. So what I would like to say is there are very much rational reasons for that above the iceberg level, but there is also a lot of cultural issues which lead to issues that you do not confront the other organization or the other department or whatsoever, confront with news which is not pleasing to the other side. Second part of closed systems is a sociological one. And Talcott Parson, a sociologist, I think he died before I was born, is really founded this theory. And it deals with the issue, how do come people in an organization? How is their induction phase? How do they make careers? How are they paid? How do they network together? So it really talks about the internal mechanisms of a homosocial system. What keeps the whole thing together in the social social processes? And there's an interesting piece also. Those are the training masts of the German Navy ship Gorch Fock, which is now on a repair station, and nobody knows when it's going to be repaired, costing now several hundred millions. But that's a side effect. That is, on the left is the training mast of the German Navy ship, and on the right side of the Italian. And you can see the difference because the cadets, the young coming officers, female and male, in the Italian Navy ship were trained with a net. In the German Navy ship, they were trained without net. Now that is, let's say, only the tip of the iceberg, but the whole thing came up when one of the female coming officers died in the night, falling down. And that was 6-7 years ago, a big scandal, and they started to study the culture in the training ship Gorch-Fock. And they found out things which I have a hard time to tell you. For example, that the young cadets had to clean up what was left over after their officers got drunk at night. So real old archaic stories, which you usually read, what's happening on the ships in the 17th, 18th century. No, it went on till into highly modern times. In the bottom of the ship, there was a rope where the machinists rode up the female slips they conquered in their visits. Archaic rituals. And naturally, the whole issue was based on discipline and not on understanding. Now this is, well, you might say, happily the scandal came because the training practices in the German Navy were really thought through completely, and new training concepts and induction concepts have been developed. But you also, on the other hand, you can see an old culture, and that is the Volkswagen culture. That is Piech, and that is Winterkorn. You can see like archaic cultures really come up into modern times. It's also the Samsung culture. So that is second piece. How are people trained, recruited? How are they being led? How is the networking? How is the culture within an organization? Then you have a psychological issue in this closed system, selective perception and blind spots. Why? And here I come, unfortunately, I cannot animate this chart, so it's overlapping. If you look, and this is an analysis of Roland Berger, done amongst 183 board members of DAX companies. And you see 172 have the same educational background. 95 never changed the company. Now I'm running out of my brain for the other things because I cannot see it. But only 8% ever founded a company, and only 5% had a break in their CV. And that is an interesting point. How can 183 people who are running DAX 30 companies, coming from the same educational background, coming from the same career pattern, being manager all the time, never having an entrepreneurial exposure, and never had a split, a break, something new in their CV, how can they lead corporations into the future? Now that is a debate which is going on, and if you read the story of ThyssenKrupp and just look back how in the connection between supervisory board and the managerial board, how this was done over decades, you understand why der Düsseldorfer Industrieklub immer die preferred recruiting agency war for the board of ThyssenKrupp. And you never saw a difference in there. So now there is also a study done at the University of Hohenheim, and they made in-depth interviews, and they came out with a conclusion, 2015, so an old study, the CEO prototype, very conscious, but unable to work in a team and not creative. Management versus leadership. Old discussion. Why closed systems remain closed? Paul Watzlawick, the famous communication researcher, Austrian American, he worked on the issue of more of the same, that you make the same always repeating again. And interestingly enough, and I mentioned Samsung before, and that is the research being done on the phone, which always started to burn and which led to a multi-billion loss for Samsung. And those are case studies on Samsung. The burning ambition was the problem. Because of the lack of diversity within the group, nobody has expressed the risks. Fatal consequences of patriarchal corporate culture and dependency on a strong leader. Change everything except your wife and your kids, despite radical design of structures, strict hierarchical thinking, creativity and excellence from the sources of fear and control. Doing the same all over again. And naturally, and perhaps some of you heard that, let's say in the 90s, I was a deep critic of German business schools. Well, in the late 90s, also of WHU. Some of the old ladies and men around the environment still remember that I gave interviews in Wirtschaftswoche and so on. But naturally, we talk about prevailing paradigms and ideologies. And you really talk about what is the content of an MBA course. Is it a copy of a Chicago course? Or is it an MBA which is very specific for Europe or Germany? Is it the Chicago boys which are being taught? Or is it not the Chicago boys which are being taught? Do students learn, besides economics, do they learn psychology, sociology, arts, philosophy? Or are they just one-rooted? So that was my discussion, which I had. And so actually, in the 80s, in the 90s, I was every year at WHU. And then roughly for 20 years, I didn't come back. So it's my first time again since the mid-90s. Yeah, but this issue, which naturally is closely connected with elite schools. And if you look at the ENA in France, where you probably train the most brilliant heads, but you train them all in the same logic, in the same procedure, so that they can be leaders in politics, in public service, and in private business. You have a sustaining ideology, a crossover. And naturally, that calls deeply into the issue of the diversity of a business school. Those are 5 ingredients for closed systems, which I just kind of really would like to point out. And if Tobias had made a research on what are the 3 big innovation preventers or avoiders. On the one hand, it is misbelief. I do not believe that our customers ever buy things which they cannot touch. I never believe, dass der Verbrennungsmotor will die. Misbelief. Dogmatic resting in old theories. Power. Innovation is taking power away from me. New people have a new logic and have power, and fear to fail. Those are, let's say, in human beings, from that research, the deep-rooted things why innovation is being prevented. Okay, the floor is yours. Closed systems. Please.
Or would you say how would a big, for example, German company break free from this situation?
I will point out at the end some ideas of mine, but probably I usually differentiate between an evangelist approach, missionary approach, the top calls the middle management and the people to change, which is usually, from my experience over the last 40 years, failing. And you talk about a structural approach that you separate traditional business from innovation business. Now, the one thing says we have to win the heads and hearts of the people for change. That's a very continental European approach for change. But if you really look in the world, what's happening, it is the split of the business, the old co and the new co is setting up something on the green field. I'm not talking now about startups. I talk about transformation of old established business. It is structural change, and people find them in new structures. So at the end, I really would debate if it is really helpful to have innovation laboratories within the given structures. And Capital made a nice survey that 2/3 of those innovation laboratories are just having an alibi function. So, and even if you look at the Mittelstand, it seems to me that the Mittelstand, that this part of the Mittelstand who is willing to transform, is trying out structural changes. Starting with very little things like having co-working spaces 100 kilometers away from the headquarters, bringing a part of the engineering development function to Berlin or to Cologne, but separating innovation from the rest. Because, and that is something which I always experienced, changing through messages is not changing behavior. You set people into a new organization and things start better. In Lufthansa, in 1994, a huge monolith, not able to change, and we split the elephant into pieces. The technical operation, the cargo company, the IT systems company, we separated the whole thing. And people naturally were afraid that they would lose jobs, but we did it so that jobs could be growing. Same in telecom. You need to touch the structure of the organization and separate innovation from efficiency. Now, even that goes down to, there is a theory in organizational science which is called the Ambidextrous Organization. Even March won a Nobel Prize on that. And it says every organization has two parts. An efficiency part where given things are being exploited, and an innovative part where you explore. And one part of the organization is an efficiency machine, and the other part of the organization is an innovation laboratory. And if that is, and this structural ambidexterity is probably the way to deal with it. Risky, yes. But better than to stick with the old. More questions and comments? Yeah, please. What really changed? Now I don't want to sound like an old man, I'm 70, so I'm probably a medium old man. Naturally, if you look at the German economies, in economy till 1995, it was an extremely close system between banks and commercial business. And banks had significant shareholder activities within German industry. And through the Finanzmarktgesetze, this incestuous system has been opened up. And organizations could act on their own. And that actually, from my perspective, was a political reform which freed up German enterprises. Otherwise, this country would not have been able to go into the globalization phase. So that significantly really changed. But this was more a matter of the regulatory conditions around the economy than the real change within the corporation, which came afterward. But it freed up the enterprises. Number two, I would say, probably in late 90s, last decade, not only the huge corporations, but the small and medium-sized enterprises coping with globalization. And that is interesting because there are not too many countries in the world which have such a large Mittelstand as we have. But Mittelstand in France, for example, is not global. But Deutscher Mittelstand really got its acts together and became global. Now that was a real entrepreneurial DNA. So that changed. That was a huge wave forwards. That not just the big dinosaurs, the Bosch and the Siemens and the car makers went global, but the Mittelstand. And that was entrepreneurial, not politically, not from the framework of politics. Now we are again in a critical situation because, like I said in my speech at the University of Paderborn, the future value creation comes more and more out of the digital economy. And if you look at the revenue development over the last 10 years, 70% of all the revenues came out of the growth of the automotive industry in Germany. 70%. And they're suppliers and they're Mittelstand supplying the car makers. If you look at the US, you have a complete different picture. The old economy is shrinking and the new economy really growing significantly. And this misshape needs to be solved. I did some research as a member of parliament. I was asking the government, where did research money in information and communication technologies since 2002 go to? We talk about many dozens of millions. 84% of the money went into the big fat cats. 10% went into Fraunhofer, Max Planck and others. And 6% in startups. Now you understand what's happened. And in the overall, let's say politics is spending every year at least 17 billion on research which should foster innovation. And it's always feeding the fat ones. The ones who have get more. And that is a key issue if you look at the Pentagon and the development of the DARPA, it's always more or less was seed money for new ventures. And we have in that respect, and that is a point where probably economists would talk about a market failure, because no venture capitalist would invest in that early phase where there is no business plan. For most of the space technologies, for example, you don't have a business plan because you have the return in 20, 25 years, if ever. So and here probably the state has to fill the market failure through spending, but not for the big fat cats. And if you look at the space, we are feeding Airbus, OHB, und Thales in France. But we do not really seed young. I just was meeting 12 Munich startups in the space business. They said we are not even included in Ausschreibungen. So, and this means a major shift in how we deal with innovation in a very, very early stage, before venture capital would come in. And because you have in the US the same situation where you have a phase where venture capital doesn't go in, where the state is really financing the first seeds of innovation. So, and that is now, at that point we are now. We solved the old Germany AG, we solved the globalization, but we are now at the point, do we catch up with the digital economies? More questions? Okay. Technology and diversity, twins for cultural transformation. Now that is a family story, because we thought about buying cleaning tools for the grill. And in Amazon some years ago, I found the Weber cleaning tools, very cheap, 12 euro or something, and the Quillbot. And in those years, I actually bought the Quillbot, and you could take out the hair, and you could put it in the dishwasher, and it really, it's nice. If you don't clean a grill after 3 days, you don't want to touch it with your hands. So I took the bot, Robert, but I'm not telling you that because we are a modern family. But the interesting point is, just imagine, how does this work environment look like? And how does this work environment look like? How are people dressed in this company? And how are people dressed in this company? What are the competencies of people over there? And what are the competencies are here? How are the people being led in this company? And how in that? And you get a feel how closely technology and work culture is connected. Because here you have the blue-collar worker and perhaps 2 or 3 production engineers, and here you have 30% engineers and software developer. Which means that the way of working culture and leadership is completely different. Now that is an old-fashioned example, but it shows you somehow the relationship between work and culture. And here we come to the point, how can traditional companies, if they do not separate structures, what could be at least approaches to create a culture which is more innovative? You probably will have space, time, and process for experimental and innovative work. 1 day a week, it's yours. You are the boss of your business. Low on hierarchy, loose decentralization, no boss culture. Decision power for people. When do they work? Where do they work? With whom do they work? On what do they work? And opening up the organization, not only in research and development, for open innovation. Those are probably, when you're not from efficiency, those seem to be approaches, especially also for young companies, where you usually come to a point after 3 years. Can we keep our entrepreneurial culture? Because the company is growing and you establish management, you establish hierarchy. And how do you keep the entrepreneurial culture? And probably those are some key issues, no matter if they are emerging or if you want to open up the culture a little bit. Now, when we talk about diversity, we can talk about diversity on the perspective of morality and human rights. Now, that is a discussion which is prevailing in Germany, unfortunately. Or you can discuss diversity from the perspective of business and economics. And there you have a majority of studies which show you that with a mixed decision-making teams, you are more successful instead with homogeneous decision-making teams. Probably there are 180 studies worldwide on the market in the meantime regarding diversity, and most of them come to the same conclusion. The more diverse in terms of race, in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of nationality you are, the more successful you are. No, not age, that's not true, but the other ones. And you can look at the perspectives of organizational existence, the innovation and resilience capabilities. And I talked about this study of Boston Consulting, and they looked at they looked at close to 100 companies in Switzerland, Austria, and Germany. And they came up with a significant positive correlation, statistically significant correlation between the diversity of the company and the revenues out of innovation. Now that is very interesting, because that is the first study which is connecting diversity not to business success but to innovation revenues. And the interesting point in this study is, and this comes back to the mixture, for example, to the board members of the DAX companies, there is a significant interdependence between the diverse industry background in an organization and innovation success. Means that a company which has managers, no matter which gender, but having served in different industries, have a higher probability of creating innovation revenues than if you have a homogeneous management. Country of origin, different nationalities also. Career path, different educational socialization, internationalization or local careers, no matter. Broken careers or very stable linear careers, the more diverse the career path, the more probable the revenues out of innovation, plus gender. The academic background, obviously there is no significant result to see, and obviously when it comes to age and innovation, age is detrimental for innovation. Interesting, not politically correct result out of this study. Now, I still would always argue in an efficiency organization, you would have a diversity of age. But probably in an innovation operation, you would look that you don't grow too old. So, but that is the significant interdependence between diversity, those four dimensions of diversity, and in innovation. Questions and comments from your side? After I introduced the ladies' quota in Deutsche Telekom, I thought I would get more questions on that. Now, an interesting point is that the diversity issue is stagnating in Germany. Has it been overexcited? Has it been too fast in the change? Has it been too much top-down and not really mentally and culturally absorbed? But the number of diversity, we have more internationals. We have more internationals in corporations and the boards. We still do not have the change of industries and branches. Very often the recruiting policies for the top is very simple. It has to fit completely. And the fit means you know the business, you know the industry, you know the branch. So we have a very homogeneous recruitment policy. The career paths are very similar, and the number of women in top management is stagnating.
We grow up in a society where everybody's promoting diversity, and you see diversity everywhere, everybody's promoting it. How was it for you to experience when you were an advocate for 30% quota? What was the response to that, and how did it evolve?
Well, it was not so much pleasant experience in my life. But also not for my CEO, René Obermann. We were in our business cast, we were denounced. Colleagues of René Obermann said, obviously his wife gave him a kick in the ass to go forwards. She's a journalist, a very critical journalist. So after in a way, he didn't do it out of himself. He got kicked by his wife. Or Thomas Sattelberger is doing that for his marketing. It was a very unpleasant situation. On the other hand, looking back now, close to 10 years later, I would have done it again. At the end, you probably new decisions are mostly unpopular. But it was really hard from the own colleagues. Yeah, we were really the outsiders. And people speculated, why do they fight for women? Well, we were very, very well aware what's in the research. But on the other hand, we also had a social. If you look back, naturally, we were aware about the business issues. But also, at a certain point, we also said a closed system, like German corporations are, is not fair. So you also have a moral point in your issue. So we argued on both sides. But it was not appreciated. Well, nowadays it's normal. Okay, let me go to the end. Path for transformation. Now, probably you know I spent 2/3 of my life in human resource roles, 1/3 of my life in operational roles. But let me just summarize from a people perspective what I think has to change definitely in the established organizations. We need to break the dominance of the established hard disciplines: engineering, economics, and law. I deeply advocate not only for interdisciplinary graduates, but also that we have sociologists and philosophers in our companies. And not only the big ones. They give you a really new view on the world. Now, the bigger you grow, the more you have chances to recruit broad-minded in that sense. But we need to open up this. Sometimes I talk about, in engineering companies, the tyranny of engineers. Now, even the consulting companies opened up completely over the last 10 years. They were a tyranny of economists. Now they really go from the physicist to the sociologist and create better results. The whole issue of how are people facilitated, coached, mentored in their careers. And how many of you know the movie, The Dead Poets Society? It's an old movie about a school where you learn writing, reading, and accounting, and discipline. And about a teacher who was creating a Dead Poets Society with his students, where they were reading new and modern literature and reflecting about the world. And the point is, in the same way as you have in the corporation an efficiency engine on an innovative laboratory, in your talent management, you have to do the same. You have on the one hand, really career path, planning top-down, succession planning, and on the other hand, you have Dead Poets Society, where talents, no matter which hierarchy and no matter which profession, come together and reflect about the world. Now that is a deep change in the way talent management is being done, but it's also a debate naturally about German universities or about German business schools. So how much is there room to experiment with myself and with new insights? And how much room is there for the traditional stuff, which needs to be learned? So and if we don't change within our corporations, but also in the educational institutions, the way we design them and have two parts, ambidexterity also in the learning of people, we might have a problem. If you look at modern practices, I would say that managers are being elected. That they are not given power from above, but they are elected from bottom up. And that leadership positions are given temporarily. Now that is a real break with the rules. A lot of innovative companies do that in the meantime, not the old ones. But if you really look where innovation comes from, it comes from the bottom, and it comes from people who are coaching their people and who have the acceptance as coaches from their people. If you look at Spotify, leadership is not being given from top, leadership is being elected from the bottom. So we need to experiment also with this old issue of the heavenly order of hierarchy. Can we, in parts which are more innovative, at least have a different view on management and leadership? Now, I'm not talking now about the maintenance organization. I'm not talking about the efficiency machine. I'm talking about the innovation parts of an organization. And if you look at the big IT companies in the US, they are very sharp at the top, very few, mostly the owners, and few managers, and they are very basic democratic in the stomach of the organization, with extremely low hierarchy. And that is something where we need, if we want to change corporate cultures, Probably it's a key issue, at least in the innovation parts of the organization. Laboratories instead of instruction schools. Gender pay gap, yes. And not only in the old business. You have a significant gender pay gap in the Silicon Valley for the same job. Now this needs to be attacked, naturally. That is a symbolic way to show that you have a fair compensation policy, no matter if you come out of the old economy or if you create the new economy. Actually, sometimes I have the feeling that the discrimination of ladies in the new economy is much harder and tougher than in the established ones. They learned their morale already, at least in major parts. Leadership culture, embrace diversity, replace old cliques, overcome unconscious bias. That's an issue for old business as well as for new business, because that is a human issue within ourselves, blind spots, perception, and organizational designs based on ambidextrosity and decentralization. Now, I said I will end up with 4 approaches for transformation. I talked about William Ross and the law of requisite variety. You need to be as variable, as diverse as your environment, but that means open your company for outsiders, pattern breakers, disruptors, transformers, grassrooters. Not everybody, but that you have a critical mass of people who are different in your organization. And I understand some of you are coming out of the Mittelstands business and a family-owned business, where the recruiting patterns are extremely homogeneous. And really to look, if you take control, if you are in power, if you are owner, whatsoever, really or if you talk with your father or your mother, whatsoever, really to talk how diverse do we recruit, not in terms of gender, in terms of outsiders, pattern breakers, and so on. Because naturally, the digital transformation is breaking down also in the smaller, medium-sized businesses. It's not just a matter of Deutsche Bank. So that is, in a true way, a diversity approach. Number 2, we talked about that actually is the Dead Poet Society, the movie, and new rules of the game, co-working spaces, labs, third places, of confrontation with new realities, power-related approaches, replace the old coaches, the old players. That is Winterkorn. Yes, but just think what happened. They never thought about not to take a car guy at the top. I know that. They did not even consider it. It had to be somebody out of the same industry. Let's wait and see. Governance in supervisory bodies, breaking up old cliques and cloning structures. And naturally, unfortunately, in many big corporations which are trying to transform themselves, the old ones are replaced by new ones which come out of the old system. If you look at Deutsche Bank, it is a sad history of old players who were replacing even older players, but always coming out of the old system. And to believe that Anshu Jain, the former CEO of Deutsche Bank, could make cultural reform, it's just weird. He is a victim and a doer of the old system. So you need also in your top placements at least to consider outside placements. And here what we talked about, the structural approaches, for me it was interesting. I was very close to the development of the E3 of BMW. And the Reithofer, the former CEO, he said, Thomas, we will not be able to develop this car in the old structures. So he created our own territory on the BMW facility with own company badges, low hierarchy, own working time regimes, no Betriebsrat, and over 5-6 years built E3. Now, he made really a structural approach to separate. Unfortunately, his successor, Krüger, did not follow up. But that is bad luck. Let me come to an end. There is a litmus test, and actually I make a presentation like that, not only to have a view on the economy and the transformation of businesses. At the end, it's about you. Because you decide at the end how much individuality do I have, how much difference do I make, how much character do I display, how much profile do I show, and how much creative thinking do I really bring to the place. Because one thing is to talk about others, what they have to do, and the other thing naturally is how are you going on with your own life into that. So the question, what kind of talent are you? I want to achieve in established organization. I want to achieve in new structure organizations. I appreciate to be well received and go with the flow. I appreciate non-conformism and don't mind to offend. And then you, on the one hand, you can live in the golden cage of living up to the expectations of others, your friends, your family. You are a rule breaker in the risk of discomforting the organization. You are floating in the modern crowd. Or you are crossing borders and master unknown territory. And at the end, when we don't take the story from the German economy and the transformation issue, but bring it back to the basics, that you might run businesses, that you might be in the driver's seat of doing that, actually, it's your decision. Thank you.